Welcome, Mary, for coming. We might have a couple stragglers come in afterwards, but I want to introduce Sondra Barrett. She's been connected with IONS for many years now. I know you've done a couple CLWs, right? Conscious Living Workshops, you've done some of those, yeah. You've had art installation even, right? Yeah, and art reception, and so you've been up here.
And I'm in the old review.
Oh, right.
Before
wow. And what
Tommy
exciting review
anybody's
even,
time,
so
yeah.
it's been many years. So she is the former faculty at UCSF Medical School and NIH cancer researcher. She brings together cellular science with spirituality for practical solutions. She's an award-winning photo microphotographer. She illuminates her insights and ideas with inspiring photos of inner space. Sondra apprentices to a shaman in her exploration of the healing arts, calling her work cellular shamanism, the ancient wisdom from our cells rediscovered through modern science. She guides us to discover how our cells communicate, decide, and how we communicate with them. And she's the author of 3 books. So welcome, Sondra.
Thank you. Thank you for all being here. It's a pleasure to finally speak to the staff and people I'd like to connect with. I have a special love for IONS. This book, Secrets of Your Cells, around 2000, I was working on a book called Cells in the Sacred. No publisher wanted it. I gave my first workshop here in 2010, and the day after the workshop, the acquisitions editor from Sounds True called me and said, "I've been following your work." I never found out how. "Do you have a book?" I said, "Well, I have a couple chapters." And so she worked with me over the summer to be able to develop a proposal so Sounds True would take it. The book came out in 2013, and now it's in 3, 4, 5 languages. I don't have the other copies yet.
Oh.
So I'm very grateful for that coming through being here. My intention today is really to cover the part of the architecture of the cell that holds intelligence from my perspective. And there's a lot more I could cover, which I'd like to in future lectures, talks, seminars. But today we focus on the innards of the cell. What do we have to learn from it? So we can think of the cell as our ancestor, and Wes Nisker has this wonderful quote: "The fact that we have ghosts living inside of us, they're the ghosts of our biological past, the earth, the chemicals, cellular life, and perhaps if we get to know them, we can turn them into our ancestors." My goal for today is that you fall in love with your cells yourself. So let me introduce you to one of your ancestors. This is a human living white blood cell. It was probably mine way back when. So in my own history, in my evolution studying cells, I'm trained as a biochemist. When you study as a biochemist, you study reductionist science. I did that at the University of Illinois, and when I came out to California, I did a postdoc in immunology and hematology, and I was forced to look at cells. This was my tool. It still is my tool, although this part of the microscope, the photomicroscopy unit, no longer works. So this was the first cell I fell in love with. It was a human white blood cell, neutrophil, the first line of protection against infection. And when I saw this living cell under the microscope, there was this aha moment of, oh my God, look how smart this is. I wasn't in that kind of consciousness at all. This cell is able to recognize that something foreign is in its environment and able to go after it, take it in, and get rid of it. If it was a bacteria, it would kill it and get rid of it. So this is a red blood cell from a sheep, and this cell has the wisdom to recognize this environmental change and track it and go after it. So that was an aha moment in terms of cells are probably more than the biology that I studied in college and high school. They also felt at that moment for me, they're sacred. There's something divine in these cells. And for me, going from studying isolated chemicals to studying human cells, it really changed my consciousness in terms of what's life all about. It also, to put it in the framework, as a mainstream, what I would say, a recovering mainstream scientist, my belief at that time, for many years still when I was at UC, was if you can't measure it, it's not real. So it really took an expansion of my understanding of life or my exploration of life to be doing some of what my kids would probably call woo-woo. So the work I was doing as a scientist way back when was to develop diagnostic tools for human leukemias. Could we distinguish one kind of leukemia from another? You might think that's easy to do. When I would sit in the clinical path conferences, physicians would be arguing about, is this a leukemia or not? What kind is it? And as somebody who could measure chemicals, I was shocked. So I got funding from NIH to develop objective criteria for distinguishing different kinds of leukemias. That was the science part. The other part was seeing that these are living leukemia cells and these are stained, so you can see more in the cell. And what I began, one of the themes running through my life's work really is things look like what they do. And so here, these cells, leukemia cells, are very chaotic in their development. They're very chaotic and disorderly in what they look like. And if you think of what happens to a family or a person who has leukemia, it creates chaos in the family. So there was that kind of circulation up here. Do things do what they do? And in science, we often say form follows function. So it wasn't that unheard of, except the psychology part of it was unheard of. Just to give you an example, these are normal human blood cells, and you can see the order, how these white blood cells all look the same compared to how disordered those are. So just in a brief kind of why was I doing this, I was doing this work basically to develop diagnosis for children with leukemia. And a lot of the photography I may show later on, I was sharing with the kids while they're waiting for their chemotherapy. Like, can you see what's inside? That's really why I got into some of the microphotography like this. So one of the stories, if we started as this first cell, how did that first cell begin? What intelligence did it have to have? So in the beginning, life needs a place. David Deamer, a scientist down at UC Santa Cruz, astrobiologist, pointed out that if we didn't have a container for the genes, we wouldn't have life, that life needed a place. I don't know that I ever heard anybody else say that. So in creating this place, molecules had to come together to create the container for life. And if we think about that first, whatever that first environment is, if we think about salad oil on the surface of warm liquid, we've got hydrocarbons that are going to float on the surface of mud or on warm water. Those hydrocarbons, salad oil molecules, will come together. And if you ever shook up a lemon juice and olive oil, you know you get little droplets, and you might get some of the olive oil containing the water. And so one of the theories is that's how that cell was formed. I mean, it's interesting if we look at evolution, we can understand one form going to another, but we really don't have much information on how was that first cell formed way back when? We just have it. So I make up science can be myths too, so I make up my own myths. In the beginning, the molecules came together. They formed this container, and Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, a theologian and a biologist, said, if there was no internal propensity to unite in the molecule itself, in other words, for the molecules to come together, it would be physically impossible for love to appear with us. By rights, we should assume the presence in everything that is. So I like to think of, probably metaphorically, that molecules embrace. You'll see that cells embrace too. So we've got this container. What's so important about this container, this cell membrane formed by these fat molecules, are 2 layers thick, thinner than a strand of hair. 2 layers thick. This is a diagram, 2 different diagrams of what a cell membrane looks like. It surrounds every cell, it protects it, it gives its identification markers, and it's also an information transmitter. What else? It's fluid and flexible. So it's not solid at all. The cell membrane moves, so if we think about we're spacious and not solid, we're not at all. In fact, you can, under the microscope, you can watch receptors on the surface of the cell move if you've got them tagged right, so they flow together. One of the things in terms of real life that influences the fluidity of the cell membrane is cholesterol. So these are cholesterol molecules. So if we have a diet that's high in cholesterol, we're changing the fluidity of the cell membrane, and someday I'd like to see somebody study, is that where the problem lies in many of our illnesses. So you can see in this diagram that we've got little projections on the surface of the cell. Some of them will say, this is me. This is so that the immune cells can distinguish me from not me. Some of them are receptor sites for receiving information or sending out information. And you see here, there are also receptors that go all the way into the cell. And I'll talk about that in a couple minutes. I want you to kind of keep in mind the metaphor of our cells and the information. As a cell becomes more mature, the membrane and the cell becomes more fluid and flexible. So what I cover in the cell book is, how are we fluid enough, or do we become more rigid as we age? How do we change that? So cells are just like us. They need each other. They don't thrive by themselves. They stay connected. And if we know from the work in psychoneuroimmunology and epidemiology, people who are connected live longer, live healthier. It all, to me, it's like, oh, the cells are showing us the way if we pay attention. So cells need community just like us. And so I'm encouraging you today, your brain makes new neurons when we're learning something new. And the more we continue to learn that, the more neuronal connections there are to engage us in that new learning. If we stop, say you want to learn Spanish or you want to learn about cells, if you stop learning, those neurons lose their connections and they'll program themselves to die. In the developing embryo, when neurons in the brain don't connect to other neurons, they're programmed to die. Cells of the immune system that could attack the self are programmed to die. So we have in our cells the ability to change our genes. I know Dean has asked some of that earlier. We'll look at how that happens. So okay, we've got this community of cells. We're trillions and trillions of cells. how do these cells communicate to tell what their needs are, how they stay connected? Well, of course, the first cell phones started way back here. Let's look at what the cell phones look like. So once again, we visit the membrane, and I want you to really consider keeping in mind shape and function, changing shape. So in this diagram of a cell membrane, you see all these projections are different shapes. And it's the shape of the molecule, these are receptor sites, that will determine what information that cell or that receptor can connect to. So we can look at this as a listening cell. So once again, we've got the diagram of the cell surface. What are you going to connect to? Well, if you're excited or fearful and your body's making a lot of adrenaline, so these are actual photographs of these molecules. If your body's making a lot of adrenaline, it's going to need a very different shape receptor than caffeine. And many of our drugs are created to block receptors. So what cells that have adrenaline on it, almost all the cells in the body have adrenaline receptors. Some of them are called beta-adrenergic receptors. If someone has high blood pressure, they're often given what's called beta blockers. Beta blockers have similar shape and chemistry to adrenaline, will lock on the beta receptor and prevent adrenaline from getting on it. And once the receptor is blocked, then the action inside the cell slows down. So this, in the old days when I used to grow heart cells, you could see if you threw in beta blockers, the cells in the dish would no longer beat. So you were preventing the action from happening inside the cell. So caffeine has a very different receptor, shape, and histamine. Our body churns out a lot of histamine. If we're experiencing an inflammatory response, it will get onto the epithelial cells and other cells that have histamine receptors. If we take, and then we've got the inflammatory response, all the symptoms of runny nose, teary eyes, itchy skin, if that's where receptors are landed on. Antihistamines block that receptor. So pharmacies become very good at developing how do we block receptors. So we've got all this information coming into the cell. Oh, let's go back. Can I go back? Bruce Lipton's probably, how many of you have read Bruce Lipton's work? So almost everybody. Bruce talks about the membrane as being the brain of the cell. At least he used to. I don't know if he still does.
Yes.
And actually what I'm going to add on to, this is just the detector of information. The brain of the cell is inside the cell. We'll get to that in a few minutes. So in life there are these synchronistic moments. 1989, my life changed. I went into the bookstore in Marin County, the Book Passage, and I see two journals, the Scientific American, and I don't have the cover of the Yoga Journal. They both use the term Tensegrity. How many of you have ever heard the word Tensegrity? I never heard of it in 1989. So it's curious because there was an article in here, like I say, changed my life, called The Architecture of Life. And Carlos Castañeda also talks about tensegrity, which I'll get into a little bit later. But it's like, what did these two different concepts, cell biology and yoga or movements, have in common? And how can you take it home? Let's look. So tensegrity was a word coined by Buckminster Fuller, and it means, I keep on looking here and realizing I could look here. Tensegrity is any physical structure that stabilizes and supports itself by balancing opposing forces, compression and tension, expansion, if you will. And it's considered now a universal principle of design that everything uses tensegrity, balancing the forces. The planets in outer space, spider web, atoms. This is actually DNA computer graphic from Bob Langridge at UCSF. So all of these structures and this human-made structure, the geodesic dome, is built on the concept of tensegrity. And I want you just to, if you can remember, the triangles, just in case. So what was the turning point for me in learning about tensegrity and reading this article by Donald Ingvar, scientist at Harvard Medical School? Donald Ingvar did some amazing studies in which he was growing cells in petri dishes. And what he saw was when the cells, just keep in mind, every cell in this dish all had the same genes. When the cells were attached and stretched out in the dish, they expressed the gene to reproduce. So in real life, if we have a wound, the cells will stretch out to fill the space. When the cells let go of a little bit of that tension, well, when the cells let go of all the tension, suppose there's not enough food in the dish, they program themselves to die. And in between, when the cells just let go of a little bit of tension, but they still have their tone, the cells mature. And where would we see that in real life? In real life, if we get a viral infection, the lymphocytes that are going to fight the virus have to keep on reproducing and making more cells. And then they get the signal, stop reproducing, mature. So what's a mature lymphocyte able to do? It's able to make different kind of chemicals called cytokines that will help eliminate the virus and kill the virus. So our cells have the ability to turn on and off genes. And Ingvar made a very convincing argument that the tension on the cell influenced, the mechanical tension, influenced what genes the cell expressed. Now the cytoskeleton is made up of filaments, microtubules. I call it the strings of the cell. We knew that the microtubules and the cytoskeleton was important for cell movement. We didn't know that it was important for regulating what the cell became. So when I do a workshop, we all get on the floor. And it's like, okay, attach to the floor. What does it feel like? Do you want to keep on repeating, always using the metaphor, repeating the same pattern? Or do you want to do something new? And often the students don't want to go to the third phase of ball up and die. But they sometimes learn that it's not so fearful, it's letting go. So we see different structures when the cells are attached and tense, and think about that from a psychological perspective. Way back in the old days, not just being an immunologist, I really got involved in psychoneuroimmunology, so really brought the mind into the cell. So what we're attached to, what are we able to let go of? The cell has to do that to change its maturity. In fact, I sometimes have called it cellular Buddhism. Jack Kornfield says, we need to learn to let go and allow the changing mystery of life to move through us without fearing it, without holding or grasping. Letting go and moving through life from one change to another brings the maturing of our spiritual being. So letting go at a spiritual or psychological perspective gives us maturity. Letting go at a cellular level brings maturity. Is it just possible that the ancient Buddhists and visionaries saw that and put it into their doctrine, something to think about. So we can visit our cell structure, and this comes from a tricycle magazine cover, and I was really surprised to see, oh, it's all strings. Why is it all stringy like the cell is? Did they know? What's the origin of our information, our intelligence? So we're strings. What do we know about strings? Who plays a guitar? Anybody play guitar? So we know when we pluck a string, the nearby strings vibrate. If we bang on a drum, drums nearby vibrate. So our cells are made of strings. For me, this was one of the exciting understandings about our cells. We finally have a place inside our cell that can respond to sound, that responds to energy, that can set the other cells up in resonance. If you think one cell at a time, one cell in a state of gratitude or hum, we bring that one cell into that state. The other cells nearby are going to come into that state. So it feels like this is an architectural design that helps explain some of the ways spiritual practices can work and give us more, for those of us who need reason, give us more, this is why you should do it, or this is how it could be working. So the law of resonance, anything that vibrates reacts to vibrations, everything's connected. Let me see what the next slide is. Oh, this is not the greatest video. I was at the Exploratorium with my grandkids and I had to capture this. The cells dividing. What scientists have shown, if you change the shape of what the cell can do, you change what the cell can do. And where we're seeing that in the clinical situation, we're seeing Valerie Weaver, a scientist at the University of Pennsylvania, showed that breast cancer cells are very rigid. And if you put breast cells in different environments, you will change what they become. If you put breast cells in, say a breast cancer cell in a rigid, hard environment, they will express cancer genes. If you put them in a soft, gel-like bed environment, they arrange themselves normally. So we're really beginning to, and if we take normal embryonic stem cells, put them in a rigid environment, they will become muscle cells. If you put them in a soft environment, they become neurons. Ingvar has taken his work also into the clinical world, seeing can we change the microenvironment of a tumor and influence whether the cell will let go, whether they will program themselves to die. Yes?
What does it mean to have a rigid environment from a cell's perspective?
Well, a hard, say, this versus this, something that's bendable. So like rubber. Put
Like
it
literally
on,
like a hard petri dish versus a soft petri dish, is that what you mean?
I don't know if they use, usually when you're growing cells in a petri dish, you have to cover it with something so the cells will attach. So they could have put a covering of, say, gelatin in the petri dish to give it a different kind of quality of surface, of tension. So hard versus soft. I'm going to expand this just a little bit. When I was writing the book, I met a new friend who was working with people who had cancer, Center of Attitudinal Healing up in Fort Bragg. And he had had cancer too. And I asked him, did he see any theme between, difference between the people who went into remission unexpectedly or stayed in it a long time? His opinion was he saw that people had let go of something big, including himself. Let go of maybe a bad relationship or a job, or they had really let go. And so this discussion started with little beep beeps up here saying, is it just possible when we do let go of something big, our cells, or if we have cancer, our cells are able to let go and program themselves to die. So our cells have choices. They have choices. They can either divide, become more of themselves, they can become mature, or they can program themselves to die. All of those are part of the natural process of cell. Yeah.
In working with cancer, have you seen instances of cells that are deceptive in their behavior?
Say that a little louder.
Cells that are deceptive in their behavior? I read recently about ovarian cancer that the cells pretend to be healthy cells. That they hide behind healthy cells and pretend to be healthy is one of the ways that they get things going, get the army going. And I thought, a cell being deceptive, that's interesting.
Well, it's not so much that they hide behind healthy cells. They look like healthy cells from the outside. Remember, well, I probably haven't specified it. The outside of a cell has identity. And this is me, this is heart cell, this is a white blood cell, whatever. A cancer cell hasn't changed it, for most parts, hasn't changed its identity. It still looks like self. That's why, for the most part, we've never been able to get any kind of vaccine. There's no immune response against cancer cells because they're still self. The change is inside of the genes. So are there cells that are more receptive? The last research I did when I was at UC was to make cancer cells normal, which my colleagues thought was a little crazy. You can't do that. We didn't even know so much. This is in the 80s. We didn't know so much about the genes then. But I certainly was seeing all these people get chemotherapy, and I said, there's got to be a better way. Can we change them? And did get funding. And in the lab, we could change leukemia cells, some of the leukemia cells, to become normal with very benign substances like retinoic acid, which is related to vitamin A, or thymosin, which is thymus hormone. So we were able to change the cell. It was just, at that point, I was finished with being in a laboratory, and I knew the next step was to start working with probably radioactivity to really be able to see what was going on, and that wasn't the direction I wanted to go. But I've always had that in my mind. We are able to change our cells, and those cells became more fluid, looking like they were more mature. So some of the markings, I don't know if they were in that population of leukemia cells, were those the ones who were more receptive or more flexible to start with?
A lot of the cancer cell become cancers because they start, they regress to being like embryo cells, right? They start expressing all these molecules that they were expressing during embryo, and that's why they start multiplying like crazy, because they're back to being, embryo-like cells.
Being children, yeah, we have mutations of the regulated.
Yeah. So what's your psychological interpretation?
Of going back? Oh, that I don't know that I can answer that in terms of going back, because if you think about those changes are in the regulatory genes, which have happened over a lifetime. I mean, cancer is really hard, in my mind, hard to study causation, because it takes, the old dogma was you had one genetic change and that made a cancer cell. The new understanding, you have 5 or 6 genetic changes before it's a cancer cell. And some cancer cells have 100 genetic changes. So did someone really need to go back and play a lot more? I don't know the answer to that, something to think about. But it's much more complicated. illness situation than we believed way back, even now. So this is where we started. This is from Leonard Nilsson's book. This is a human egg cell, and these are sperm. They get together. They create this wonderful human body that's us. Can you imagine we started as one intelligent cell? It created a ball of cells, and the idea in terms, this was something that came to me this morning, the idea of how does the cell know to become the brain or know to become the gut? The story was always location, location, location. If it's on the top, it's going to become the brain. If it's on the outside, it's going to become the skin. If it's in the inside, it becomes the belly and the mesoderm. And what we can think about, each part of that ball is going to have a different state of tension and forces, a different state of tensegrity. Something I'd never thought about until thinking about the ball and cell this morning. Like, so the state of tension could influence, think of the outside of the ball versus the inside of the ball, influence what the genes are expressed. So all these cell types in our body, these drawings, come from that same cell. They look very different, they do different things, and their genes are expressed very differently. So I really want you to keep in mind that our cells have the ability to turn off and turn on different genes. That's part of their their intelligence. So we've got these strings of our cells that respond to movement, dance, qigong, sound, there's work now on acupuncture and massage influencing the connective tissue of the body, which influences the connective tissue of the cells. And because this matched the shape of the cell, I had to include it. It didn't make any sense. And if you do ask me questions, I might dance for you. We'll see. So another theme around the intelligence of the cell that's regulating the decision maker, that's regulating what the cell can do. The cytoskeleton, does it hold consciousness? So the strings of DNA, I'll skip that for now. So to bring it brings us back to magical passes first. What Carlos Castaneda was saying, that there's certain physical practices called magical passes that were handed down to him from the ancient sorcerers of Mexico. And if you did these different practices, you changed your consciousness. And if you did them enough, you changed your shape. Yeah. You could become a wolf or what have you. So he never talked about cellular tensegrity. He talked about changing the energy, of deploying, using the energy differently with these different practices. And here we've got, how many of you have ever heard of Felicitas Goodman? Felicitas Goodman was a lot of our work, important work comes from anthropology. She was an anthropologist who was looking at the different pre-Columbian art and seeing that these different statues had different postures. And so she postulated that the postures were for doing ritual, and would that change consciousness? And in fact, when she had people do these very different postures, there's a place now in New Mexico that is carrying on her work, that consciousness was changed. Here are a couple of different postures. So it brings the physical into changing consciousness. And is that changing? I propose that it's changing the cytoskeleton. Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist down in Arizona, said his theory is that the microtubules carry the electrons of consciousness. For when he gave anesthesia, he's an anesthesiologist, when he gave anesthesia, when you get anesthesia, what happens is the microtubules are frozen and everyday consciousness disappears. Underlying consciousness is still present. So he's proposing that the microtubules in the neurons carry consciousness. But since every cell has microtubules, doesn't every cell have consciousness, would you think? Possibly. And if we think of the different postures, the mudras that people do in yoga, that has to be changing our physical structure. What would happen if we do that for a long period of time? So these are a couple, you can get magical passage. There's a group down in LA called Clear Green that's actually teaching the Tensegrity passage, magical passage. And they look a lot like yoga, they look a lot like some of Tai Chi and Qigong. So all these practices knew that they could change the health of the body as well as what's happening in their brain, their cell brain. So what have I learned, what are we learning from ourselves? That they're always in the now. Always in the now. I read Eckhart Tolle, I listened to him, I read Ram Dass, Be Here Now. Those were all intellectual constructs for me. It was only, I'd say writing the book was transformative. It was only when I was driving to Sonoma, to the town of Sonoma, getting ready to give a talk, and my mind is in all this chatter, boyfriend's money, blah, blah, blah. I'm driving by vineyards, and my other little voice says, look what you're missing. You love vineyards, be here now. And there was that aha moment of, I'm always up here, I'm not in the now. And when we're not in the now, we're feeding ourselves with different messages. So it's much easier for me, for sure, to get in the now, because I know what I'm giving to my cells. So if you only had that lesson for today, your cells are always in the now. Are you taking them someplace else? If you want to sit at your computer like I do, they need to go out for a walk. They need to stretch. What do we need to let go of? Is there a place we need to let go? Usually it's fear. How do we find ways to do that? Probably more psychological ways, but will the physical ways bring us into a state of letting go? So we have all these different ways of tuning into ourselves, sound, energy, tension. I know Bruce says that changing our beliefs influences our genes, but I haven't yet to see the data, if anybody else has. What we do know about changing our genes and our cells, work came from Dean Ornish. Some of you are probably familiar with Dean's work. Dean worked with men who had prostate cancer, and he said, I'm going to put them in the same kind of group as what he basically did with people with heart disease. Going to change their diet with their low-fat, vegan diet, group support, stress reduction. They learn yoga, and he's measuring their prostate cancer genes before and after a 3-month intervention. And lo and behold, the prostate cancer genes went down from 3 months lifestyle change, and the protective genes went up. So whether that's beliefs changing of the possibility that we can change, or lifestyle change, we need to shift our beliefs to change our lifestyle for sure. But I think we can't just change what's happening in our head. We need to do more than that. So in the long program, yes, sir.
Yeah, so Garrett IONS was not here today, he's on vacation, but he studies exactly that at IONS. How belief he doesn't study changing genes, he studies changing gene expression, because he's into this microRNA, which gets
Right.
regulated, but that's exactly what he does, trying to induce, and he's working with horses and things like that, trying to induce changes in beliefs and see how this affects gene expressions.
Well, I think that's a great possibility. In real life, I think we need more than changing beliefs. I mean, beliefs are thoughts. Thoughts change emotion, thoughts change our action. So beliefs are up here. Does changing our beliefs influence what we do in our life? Rather than, I've just changed believing that I don't have cancer. Will that change my body? I don't know that just changing what's happening in my mind is enough. That's my own bias. Because I think changing what's happening in my mind is what's going to change my behavior, which will influence the expression of my genes. And a personal story. No, I won't go there. Okay. Life's operating instructions. So these are the lessons of our cell that are really connected to the architecture of life and what a cell has to do. Everything you have to do for life, your cell has to do for life. We create sanctuary. We have to know ourselves, our purpose. And a big one is letting go. What do I let go of? Can we tune in? Can we tune into ourselves? You want to try tuning into yourself? Yes? Okay, so let's, I'll just finish my little promo piece. These are all the books. Cells are in the now, let go and listen. These are some of the programs I've got developed. Oh, I don't want to get into this yet. Okay. So it's interesting when things come to you. Last night when I couldn't sleep because I was a little nervous about showing up here today, I remembered when I was going around the country teaching continuing education and how nervous I would be the night before and driving to a place and couldn't sleep. So I started doing, how many of you know progressive relaxation? I started doing progressive relaxation and there was that aha moment. So progressive relaxation was a practice developed in 1930s by Edmund Jacobson, a psychiatrist. And Jacobson observed his patients coming in who were highly anxious. They were like this. And he said, I wonder if I can get them to recondition themselves so they're not in a state of anxiety. And so he had them go through their bodies, tense and relax, tense and let go, every part of their body. And soon they were in a state of relaxation, state of inner peace that they didn't know without the tension and relaxation. And I realized that's Tensegrity in action, tension and release. He didn't know those words, but that was what was happening. And progressive relaxation is often the first stress management practice anybody learns. Down in Stanford, they were using that for men with prostate cancer. Can we teach them? They need something to do for relaxation. So that's a start. So if you want to do a Tensegrity practice, you can do tense your forehead, release it, tense all the muscles in your face. You want to try it, release it, tense your neck, tense your shoulders, release it. And if you pretend or get ready to tense, you also are tensing your body. So tensing your shoulders, tensing your fists, and you can go through your whole body and experience a real letting go if you need a physical way to do that. So before, I don't know if I'll have time to get into this other stuff, not related to cell
You have half an hour, so.
Oh,
In
I have
15
to-
minutes you can do.
Well, I wanted,
Sure.
let's get into ourselves. Let's see if we can do that. Get an experience of listening, because we do need to listen. And if you think your cells don't talk to you, how many of you have a relationship with your cells? Anybody have a conversation? Oh, good. How do they talk to you?
It's just a intuitive knowing. It's a sort of a, I need to relax, or I've had kidney problems last year, and so it's sort of like, well, what do you want? How can I help you? And it's just it's an intuitive conversation.
So does that intuitive conversation come from the intelligence of our cells, our soul?
It's not coming from my brain.
Definitely not from your brain. I will share one other Earthrise story. When I was writing the book, I gave a workshop here. And I was so in my head. The workshop was very heady, not experiential, not spiritual at all. And my Sunday morning, I was pretty upset with myself and thinking, what's going on? You've been writing this book for a year, and that's all you're giving them is head stuff. So I went and sat in the garden to meditate. And sitting in the garden and meditating, I thanked my cells for getting me here, getting me to this place. And suddenly there was this, oh, you finally got it. And I'd never heard that kind of conversation from my cells. And they went on, I said, I thought I was just making this stuff up. And they said, no, we've been telling you that all along. Like, okay, go back and teach it from us. We've been giving this to you. It's like a little my psychotic way of knowing, or is it reality? So let's see if we can get into ourselves. Take a couple moments to close your eyes. Get comfortable where you're sitting. And if you don't feel like doing this, just sit with us. And then bring your awareness to the place that feels like your center. Where's the core? Where's the core of you? And just let your body tell you. And then bring your awareness to what feels like your outside surface, your outside edge. And what does that feel like? And now that's your self. And what we're going to do is tune your self. And with each out breath, you're going to do a So take a deep breath in, and on the exhalation, do and do it. Repeat it, doing it at your own rhythm, and notice what you feel in your body. So just think that each cell, the strings in each cell, are vibrating with your hum. And the neighboring cells are going to also vibrate in that hum. And now just take a couple of moments to breathe and be with your cells. You might even pose a question. Is there anything you want me to know now? So bring your awareness back to your breath and bring your hands together. And you may feel a moment of gratitude for all your cells do for you. They are you. Cells are us, let's face it. They take care of us. How are we going to care for them? And learn to listen. Be quiet, be still, in the now. And when you're ready, open your eyes. And if you went too far out, bring yourself back. In Qigong, we would tap all over our bodies. Questions, comment before I go on to the next? So a lot of the Qigong practices, especially the self-massage practices, are also Tensegrity practices. We can think about changing the fluidity of the body.
Can you,
Shall we read? You want to,
I was going to ask you a question, actually.
pardon me?
I was going to ask you a question.
Sure.
So, I'm not totally understanding the strings part of the cells. What do you mean by the string?
The
Sondra,
cytos,
apologies, it's not you. Pay no attention.
cytoskeleton, let's see if a picture. Okay, here's a picture. So if we look at, this is an old drawing of what a cell looks like. And in fairly current biology, we couldn't see we couldn't see the strings, the filaments of the cell, unless the cell was stained in a particular way. So in living cells, you really couldn't see it. Most of us in biology were brought up with the cell is a ball. It's got a membrane, it's got a nucleus, and there's jello inside, and all this stuff is just thrown inside. Well, it's not jello. The fabric of the cell, or the matrix of the cell, are all these filaments that connect the membrane to the nucleus, that connects all parts of the cell. It's easier to see it as strings. So there's three kinds of components to the cytoskeleton. Fat tubes, intermediate filaments, maybe like this, and then real gossamer strings, filaments, skinny filaments. And in this drawing you can get an idea of some of these. In many ways, we're only really touching the surface of this part of the cell. It's probably, in my mind, the most important part of the cell. Not only because it's a decision maker and it regulates the genes. The cytoskeleton acts as a train. When the mitochondria is making energy, molecules of energy, how does that energy get to another place? The microtubules have to move it. So it's acting on a lot of different information. So this gives you an idea of what the strings are. So we're not jello. We've got this matrix within every cell, kind of like a spider web that connects all the cell. Do I don't know if I have any pictures up here of real cells with that. Well, yeah, that. Where's that little guy? Here. You can tell I don't know how to use this. Come back. Here. This guy. You can see these are the strings. It's basically the connective tissue, connective elements of the cell. And a lot of them are made up of the same thing our muscles are, actin-myosin. So they contract and release. And you wanted me to do interpretive dance? Okay, any other questions before I move on to the really esoteric? I thought if any place I could talk about it here. Well, I'll give 3 plugs for the cell book. I don't know if the bookstore carries a cell book. In the fall, in October, the Ultimate Immunity is coming out in a paperback, and the bookstore used to carry the wine book, Wine's Hidden Beauty. We've done some work with intention and changing the taste of wine here. Okay, so here's the question, burning question that's gone through me. One, I want to know where information comes from. So are there messages that are hidden in our cells and our molecules? Are our cells and molecules more than biology and chemistry? Did spiritual practices, ideas, and art have their roots in biology? And did the ancient shaman and visionaries see this? They probably didn't obviously have our names, but did they see inside and put it into their practices? So some of the first belief shifts happened for me when I was down in the Southwest photographing petroglyphs and pictographs. I wondered if this wasn't DNA on the wall and not just a path. And I'm going to get up to share this with you. Way back when, before your time, Noetic Sciences had a publication, and they were the first ones to ever publish my DNA picture in black and white to illustrate an article on genes.
What year? What year?
1989. They also put a first black and white of the wine that changed my life. You can take a look if you want. It's pretty dinged up. And in my imagination, this medicine wheel suddenly became, could this be a cell? We've got the nucleus of the cell, we've got the cytoskeleton, we've got the receptors or identity markers on the outside of the cell. Was that just a possibility? And this was not on any substance. And then we look at Robert Langridge's DNA, computer graphic, and the Sri Yantra. There, to me, looks like a big similarity. By the way, way back when I was at UC, I was working on a book for kids, and I wanted to show the pretty molecules, and I asked Langridge, would he give me computer graphics of the molecules? Well, at that time, there were none. He said, well, you can come into my lab, people will train you how to do this. It's like, after 2 weeks, it was beyond my mind. I couldn't learn that kind of language. But he gave me permission for this book I was doing with kids, which is still undone, to use the DNA picture. And when I was getting ready to get this book published, I asked him, can I use it in that book? And I was always showing this picture with this facing down. And when I gave him that picture, he said, you're showing it upside down. Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry, I just used my
So
hand.
this is a computer graphic looking down the top of DNA. And I've questioned, did our need to develop mandalas come from knowing this part of ourself? Or why is this so important, a map of the universe? Is this the map of the universe? It's up to you to decide.
I think it's possible that people in these higher states are just tapping into these more universal archetypes that cells or manifestations of that, and so are the medicine wheels and other manifestations.
So it doesn't seem
Right,
far-fetched to you.
right, right.
Oh, good, good. I knew I was in the right place. So in this exploration, I see a theme. Remember I said pay attention to the triangles that were in the geodesic dome? So there's a creative principle of threes. I'm calling it a triad biology. The genetic code is 3 letters. There's a possibility of 4 letters, but the code is 3. When we develop as an embryo, we develop in 3 embryonic layers in 3 weeks, by the way, and we're the 3rd planet from the sun. Just saying, just saying. And we have 3 brains, the triune brain, the reptilian, survival, emotional, and the thinking neocortex. And then we can throw in the I Ching, just to trigrams. And then we look at what about the divinity and different triads we see there. Michael Schneider wrote an incredible book called The Beginner's Guide to Constructing the Universe. And if you're interested in sacred geometry, you have to have that book. So he says the triangle is the ultimate symbol of divinity. Now let's look at the triads in religions. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. In the Hebrew Jewish tradition, Yahweh, Shekinah, the feminine face of God, and Ruach, the breath of God. And in the Hindu tradition, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. And in the Buddha tradition, the 3 jewels, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, and a fancy triangle. And then there's real life. We've got the 3 musketeers, the 3 little pigs, 3 blind men, 3 wishes, the ABCs, 1, 2, 3, hip hip hooray. So where does our obsession with 3 come from? Is it that inner wisdom that our creation is built on 3? Some philosophers say we don't have completion until we have 3. 1 and 2, it's polarity, and the triangle is the first stable geometric form. So I put it to you, if you want to do this research for yourself or in a group, can we use this 3? Can we get up there? Can we use the 3? Can we use the creative principle to change our genes, to change ourselves, to change our actions? Can we have a spiritual vision, an intention, and an action? Can we put it in a posture? I'm reaching up, I'm bringing it in as a prayer, I'm bringing it down to earth. So this is something for you to, how might I change myself? Will I do it better if I do it as threesome? Or maybe with 3 people? Just an idea to entertain. And again, the take-home lesson. You might have many years ago, Noetics did a book called The Heart of Healing and a TV show, which I hope you have it. It was brilliant. So the heart of healing, letting go, connect, and gratitude. If we do those things, ourselves are very happy. Ourselves are very happy. So can we be in the now and be in the wow and celebrate? It's as easy as 1, 2, 3. This, by the way, is from a wine made from in a spiritual way, biodynamically, a heart. And then we have, in the end, these 3 things matter most from Buddha. How well did you love? How well did you live? How well did you learn to let go? As above, so below. Ourselves are our teachers. Take good care of them. Thank you. So are
Thank you.
cells Buddhists? Any comments?
Just, it would be worth an exploration of determine whether there's any sacred geometric forms within the structures of the cell.
Well, my next dream project is the code finder that looks at sacred geometry in the cell.
Well, there you go.
So you also took a bunch of photographs of cells too, and
Not in this. I don't take photographs of cells anymore. I don't want to stick myself. Still have that microscope. I still take photographs, mostly of wine these days. Wine too tells the story of life. It's tiny, when it's juice, it's tiny, geometric. It gets larger and more complex, it's soft, some of them. And as it loses its vitality, it loses its ability to reflect light. So you could see it losing its light. It grows up. And I've learned which wine I don't like because of the shape of it.
I have a couple of comments or questions. The first is kind of what tips would you have to like communicate on a deeper level with our cells, or kind of practices to do that, to like get the wisdom of our cells?
Well, for me, what gets me there is meditation. And sometimes when I can't quiet my mind, I'll use sound. By the way, the sound we did came from Arlen Marlberg, a psychologist in Wisconsin, who, when his patients had lost their sense of self, he had them do 15 minutes of that. I wasn't quite ready to do 15 minutes. And it brought them into themselves. And in a couple of months, they were able to make decisions they couldn't otherwise. So for me, if I can't get quiet and meditate and listen, and always ask, I need to do sound first, or move first to get inside. But it's really a practice. It's really, and asking, what do you have to tell me? Because I don't get it as clear as I did in the garden, ever. That was the first time I was in total shock. Like, what? You really talk to me? I'm not just making this stuff up. So I would say meditation is the best. And if you're a body person, doing some kind of stretching, find your way that will get you inside. But we need to be quiet. For sure we need to be quiet to do it.
And then my second question is about like plant communication. So like from this worldview of all cells have intelligence and you can communicate with them, I'm curious if you have anything to say with like communicating with like animals or plants, or what kind of your perspective is on that.
Do you know Jeremy Narby's book?
Mm-mm.
Oh, you definitely need Jeremy. Jeremy, one more anthropologist. He went down to the his book is called The Cosmic Serpent. He went down to the rainforest to help save the rainforest for the native people. And he knew that many of these native people were ayahuasqueros. And, So ayahuasca is a brew made of several plants. And so Narby asked, and one plant prevents the breakdown of the active ingredient. So Narby asked the ayahuasquero, how do you know which plants? There are thousands of plants here in the rainforest. How do you know which ones to put together? The plants told us.
Mm-hmm.
So if you read his book, he does do a couple of ayahuasca journeys, seeing that a lot of the paintings that come out that visioning our DNA, the double serpent, the cosmic serpent. So that's different kind of plant speak. My own belief is plants have consciousness. Animals do. I mean, I know whenever I'm going to give a talk someplace or do something that's important career-wise, a deer shows up. So is it just the neighborhood? I mean, a deer showed up, like, okay, I'm in the right place, coming here. What is your belief?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that, and I'm interested more in like plant communication, especially within the environmental crisis, and what can we learn from the intelligence of the plants, as they're also, you know, trying to help this where we're at right now. So just as of recently, I've become much more interested in like the research and how people have been and are communicating and getting messages from like plants and the natural environment. So.
Well, if you think about plants, they're really smart.
Yeah.
They have to stay in place to do their work, and they take our waste product and convert it to something useful. So, do you sit with, that's another, can you sit with plants? And again, it's that quiet listening. Are we willing to take that kind of time to listen? Do I listen to my plants? Well, I talk to my plants. I know when I'm not treating them right. Important work to do. Yes.
I was just going to add that, you know, I have an experience. I'm a shamanic practitioner, lightweight, but for me, it's about understanding that you can have a relationship with the plant or with the animal or with yourself. You take it serious. It's a peer. It's not a subservient thing. It's your equal, and therefore you can just you can request things it's capable of. You can ask it to help. You can ask it to forgive. You can ask it to assist. You can ask it to inform, because it's a peer. And that's just, you have to believe that, otherwise you can't enter the conversation with it.
Thank you. And related to that, a little bit of the personal story. At the beginning of the year, I was given the potential diagnosis of liver cancer. And so I really had to go in and talk to my cells. And since I have this letting go story, it's like, what do I need to let go of as part of my healing if I did have cancer? And the first thing was fear. Let go of fear. And however I did that with prayer, with friends, with not researching liver cancer at all, Googling it. Doing those kind of practices, you know, my cells said that's what the first thing you have to do. Unfortunately, I didn't get that diagnosis. I don't know whether I turned it around with all the practices I was doing, or it was just never there. Up until the biopsy, it was clear that it was there. And my daughter, who's a scientist, she's a cancer researcher, of course. Her colleagues told her that the kind of cancer they thought I had 6 months to live. And she didn't tell me, fortunately, but then she was filled with all this fear. And only after did she say. And we have very different belief systems. So her first thing to me when the biopsy was normal was, oh, you think you turned it around, don't you? Yeah. It's a possibility. It was a possibility. I live in the possibility. I think we all need to live in the possibility.
I had a similar experience with intestinal cancer. I just be brushing my teeth, and cancer would just, awareness would just wash over me. Just moments in my day, a cancer awareness would just wash over me. And then I went through this similar process to
and you can't prove it. I mean,
But you know it.
but you know it.
You know it in a deep, intuitive way, and because the gratitude meets the knowing. Love lives in the knowing, and that's the proof we put in.
And, you know, I went through the same with breast cancer, and I was really happy to see that many of the things that you talked about were the intuitive things that I did during that process. But for me, the most important thing was changing the story that we hear about the battle and fighting. And I just thought, I love my cells. I love every cell. I love every cancerous cell. I'm just going to invite it to change. I'm going to invite it to live in a different way. I want to honor it when you talk about honoring. You know, that they are trying to tell me something about my experience here, and I want to hear them. And so I did go through all the medical stuff that was involved, but I really do believe that my healing was with the practices and the listening and the changing of the metaphor. And I don't even like the word survivor, because I don't think that was my journey.
Yeah, it's one of mastery.
Yeah, that's a nice word. Ooh, that's a nice word.
To mastery?
The journey of mastery.
Yeah.
This is one of disease.
Exactly.
So would you say that cancer cells are in a state of regression? Like you said, it's almost like they're in a more immature state, and then they need to mature, they need to gain wisdom themselves?
Well, metaphorically, you could look at it that way.
Right.
But there's at least 200 different kinds of cancer, so every cell type is different. Is it an immature cell,
Okay.
or is it really a cell that's lost its way and being able to regulate itself and follow the rules of the community? You know, that
It's also,
stop
there's-
growing.
There's another perspective on that is that it's an intelligence guiding us down a path. Do we need to go through this disease experience so that you can come into deeper awareness of yourself and creative possibilities? I'll take you there if you really want to go that way, or we can just give up this game and transition back to perfect peacefulness right now. So there's an intelligence there, a wisdom that leads us and guides us and goes with us, that can be the cancer, that can be the cold, that can be the allergy. So it's not a us and them, there's a partnership, there's an ally there.
Yeah, what do we have to, I mean, I've always seen illness as, what's the lesson? What do I have to learn? You know, what's the message of it? In fact, been writing for Huffington Post recently, and I just put a blog up this week on the personal story, but the message in illness, what's healing all about? We each have our own way, you know, what feels right. I know Brandon O'Regan, who'd been vice president here many years ago, had researched spontaneous remission. I imagine the book is someplace. And Carol Hirschberg worked with him, and Carol wrote a book called Remarkable Recovery, looking at, was there a psychological profile for the people who went into remarkable remission? And what she saw was people chose, there was not, if I only think a certain way, people chose what felt right for them. That was the kind of one theme.